So this particular unit that we're going to be looking at studying today, is Unit 2, and it's called Operations Design and Management. Now, the main purpose of this unit primarily is to, equip learners, with details about, why there is a lot of planning required when we look at planning for space, when we look at planning for raw material. It could be planning for labor. In some cases, it could be also planning, for storage, because some of the goods and services are then forwarded on from a particular location onwards to, another location. So when we look at large companies like Amazon, we look at DHL, UPS, so the shipping container companies like Maersk, they do a lot of planning in this because they have to move material from one location to the other in order to look at, meeting the demands of consumers in the market. So it has to do with supply and demand in some cases. And this is where a lot of operational planning goes into when a company or a large organization looks at planning for, warehousing, distribution in particular, and onwards freight of goods and material. So in this particular unit, we're going to be looking at studying, things around how goods are moved globally. We're also looking at studying some key models about, when we look at logistics and planning in particular. And these models will primarily be focused on understanding things like, why there is a need for, planning location, a facility. And in some cases, when we look at going into other factors, things like transportation, we'll also look at, things which can be affecting the whole planning process, which could be environmental factors, it could be common legislation. So these kind of things will typically be looked at. Now, one of the key things on this particular unit is that it utilizes something called the production concept. So when most companies essentially look at, say, for example, get into planning of expansion of their facilities. So when we look at a company like, say, Amazon Logistics, which starts to cater and starts to sell their products and services in a particular geography where they are not present, so when they look at that, they look at the, they dip back and look into something which is to do with what is called the production concept. And this is where, the companies in some cases would primarily look at that they need to understand what the customers want in terms of products and services, and how these production, the products and services can actually be available cheaper to customers by bringing that, the whole idea of goods and services closer to their geography. So some part of it will be related to understanding, the production concept, which is normally used in the field of marketing, but we apply that here because what most companies do is when they plan demand and supply and they look at expanding demand and supply, they would primarily look at, getting into and understanding the needs and wants of customers for a particular geography. And that is where, the planning and warehousing and the distribution, transportation side of things in terms of parameters tends to come in. One of the other things that this unit will also focus on is primarily to look at which quantitative side of things will come when we look at planning, forecasting. We look at things like there is something called production planning and control, PPC in particular. And when we look at those concepts, now if I look at a decade back, most of these concepts were primarily done through different models and frameworks which were created. But now with the availability of SAP, for example, some of the softwares, look at database softwares, you look at, in particular, these software modules which have been created on, SAP in particular, help to do these, more, I would say, automatically using technology. But some part of this understanding has to be brought in so that you're able to understand, the key planning techniques or models that we apply when we look at this particular unit. And if you are an operations planner or if you are a warehousing space planner, then how do you look at managing space for a product line that you need to bring in? And that is where the concept of role of forecasting, linear programming, some of the things which are framework related, theoretical framework related to be considered. And in that, there are lots of different types of material planning softwares available, and those are the ones that we will refer to at some stage, which one part of it could be done elementary on Microsoft Excel. because small organizations could not, because of costing issues, will not be able to afford, say, for example, expensive software or modules which will allow this to be done. But basics of this, if you look at a small store or a shop, in which a shopkeeper essentially plans the storage of material, what is required in terms of minimum order quantity, MOQs as we call it, is primarily done for him because it's a small business and that need can be catered through by doing it on Microsoft Excel. So when the order quantity in the shop drops, or the inventory in the shop actually drops below a particular quantity which has been defined, that triggers basically reordering from the supplier. So there are softwares like ERP, and you look at enterprise resource planning, and you look at SAP in terms of module in particular called materials planning, and those are the bits that we will theoretically understand, in this particular unit. So this is one of the core units when we look at logistics and supply chain planning, because if you're going to be working within this field, you need to have a very good understanding of, and to a certain extent have good analytical skills in how doing material planning. There are various words which can be used, but essentially what we look at is when you look at material planning, that will then dip into factors like transportation, it will dip into factors like warehouse planning, and in some cases you will also look at manpower planning, because if you have a certain amount of load to be moved, when we look at an example of shipping containers being shipped across using sea freight, and one of the planning part of it also involves, say, 15,000 containers to be loaded in and offloaded, or 5,000 containers to be loaded in and offloaded within a certain amount of time, because time, quality, and cost are in a particular circle. So it is very critical for shipping companies to look at also managing this, and in those cases you also look at manpower planning. How much of manpower is required to ensure that there is effective utilization of time to be able to offload and then reload that ship so that it can go onwards to its destination for transportation. And that is the same case if the freight is being transported through airlines or obviously air freight. So these are basic things that we are going to be looking at understanding in this particular unit. And in today's session, we are going to kick this off by looking at understanding the first learning outcome. And that first learning outcome would look at building on some sort of basic and fundamental understanding on understanding what are the key issues which the organizations or businesses actually face when they look at the whole concept of planning around materials, manpower, transportation, distribution, warehousing, and things like that. So is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, let's go ahead with dipping into some of the slides. Now, this particular learning outcome has 3 assessment criteria, so we'll look at them individually in in 1 or 2, in fact 3 parts on this particular presentation. Now, before I get into first part, what I want to look at is understand and ask you a few things, because there are some key words in this particular unit which have been covered in, say, for example, the unit aim. Now, what do you understand by quantitative? What does the word quantitative mean?
Which is expressed in numbers.
That is correct. So quantitative, aspect of doing design and operations management in this unit is basically related to the calculation, manipulation, readjustment of numbers, and that is very important when you look at, say, for an example, warehouse planning, or when you look at primarily space planning for a large warehouse that the company is going to look at. So quantitative is a key term in this particular unit, and we need to be clear about the definition of quantitative. And quants or quantitative essentially means related to numbers. Now, the second thing which I would look at in particular, as a small term, would be why do we look at location? What is the importance and relevance of location when we look at planning in general? Any ideas on that?
Location, basically wherever it should serve a purpose. It should be nearest and should cost minimum, and at a place where a purpose is served, where a customer could be served, and where a warehouse, it should be near a production facilities and customers likewise.
That is correct. So when we look at location, Now, this particular bit, again, is going to be important because when we look at the word location itself and how companies plan, say, for example, setting up a production facility, or they decide to set up a warehouse or a storage facility, in those cases, the location is quite important, or the place is quite important, because it is going to be helping them to cover the last mile in terms of, when I say the last mile, which is because the last mile connectivity, which is basically supplying to either their suppliers, partners, distributors, or supplying to consumers directly, would then shortcut the time and the duration and the cost required to basically get those products and services over to the customer. So a classical example here would be, I would probably dip into things like Amazon or eBay, which we use more or less every day. And what we do generally get to see is that at some stage, Amazon or eBay have to look at building warehouses in a particular country, and the location of that warehouse or that facility is either close to a seaport, or it is close to a large airport terminal wherein air freight can be easily handled. So depending on the place where the location in which they can actually reach and distribute, or in terms of some cases store materials, becomes quite important. So place is also, or location is also, one of the important terms within this particular unit. Now, the third thing which I want to look at in terms of key terminology would be that when we look at quality models, there are lots of quality models that we study, and we've come across things like total quality management, just-in-time, Kaizen. We look at CQI, continuous quality improvement. These are all ISO, for example, ISO, different types of ISO certifications. Now, these are all quality marks which at some stage most companies need to look at, and why they have been created over the years is that in some cases related to material planning. So, for example, when we look at just-in-time introduced by Toyota, we look at Kaizen introduced by the Japanese firm again. When we look at total quality management, European Foundation for Quality Management, these are different terms and terminologies which are created by different organizations over the years. And when we look at say, for example, we look at the whole aspect of how this process needs to be managed. At some stage, most organizations would look at then having some sort of a process through which they follow to ensure that time, quality, and cost are optimum as far as planning, warehousing, transportation, distribution is concerned. So one of the key terms that we will also look at some stage would be the various planning models which have evolved over the years in terms of when we look at when you look at the concept of materials planning. Now, are we aware of anything which is to do with ISO related for materials planning? Any idea on that side?
ISO related, like standardization code or what?
Yeah, standardization code. So yeah, so when we look at ISO is a it's an international standards organization which has over the years they've created a lot of different types of markings. So there is ISO 9001, ISO 9002, and there are loads of it, 27,000, 20,000. So over the years, this is an organization. When it was created, when they created the International Standards Organization, it was primarily done, to create some quality standards around manufacturing. But over the years, they have been extended to production side of things as well, and on planning and operational side of things as well. So some part of this dips into, when we look at production planning and we look at operations management, ISO 9002 actually specific to quality systems which are related to production and installation. Is that okay? So at some stage, when we look at the ISO 9000 series in particular, there are lots of different types of certifications which have been created over the years, which monitor, manage, and help us implement quality-related guidelines in this particular sector. So one such certification within the ISO certification is the ISO 9000, 9650, and ISO 9002, which are primarily related to operations, production, and material planning. Is that okay? So these are some basic requirements when we look at, that we are going to cover when we start looking at some of the presentations. And these key terminology and concepts will actually come in, into the unit from time to time. Now, one of the other things, I'm not too sure, but if that was covered in Unit 1, but just very briefly, I want to mention before I get into the slides, again, is that when we look at the concept of, management, when you look at the name of the qualification, it says Diploma in Logistics and Supply Chain Management. Now, what are the three different terms when you look at, supply chain and when you look at logistics? So any idea in terms of what is logistics? How do we define logistics for a business or, logistics in general for an organization?
Logistics
What does in simple term mean?
Transfer or movement of goods or material from one place to another. It could be final product or raw material.
That's correct. So good, very good on that. So I think when you look at logistics in particular, when I say generic term logistics, it could mean logistics means it is basically transportation. It is the management of transportation of goods, products, services. It could be, in some cases, even when I use logistics, if I plan to go from, say, Manchester to New York, it is a bit of logistics, but then I would start to go into planning that whether I'll go by flight, whether I'll go by, sea, or will I do a combination of a couple of things. But it might be a crude or a rudimentary term when I look at just looking at logistics from a point of view of individual. But when you have lots of things to be transported or going from one location to the other, we then broaden the term and use something called logistics. Now, why is logistics important? Because obviously in this particular course, we are talking about the management of transportation of goods, products, services, material, inventory, loads of different types of things. Logistics will also be used for information. Now, what is logistics or information? Management information system. So when we look at large scales of information being processed, and we need the help of systems to process that, I would use something like an MIS, and that would be logistics for managing information. So logistics is a key term. What do you mean by supply chain?
Supply chain.
What do you mean by supply chain?
The entire procedure from the very first supplier to the very end customer, and the steps which involve between that is known as supply chain.
Yeah, what you said is essentially correct. So if I generalize that as a definition, because this is something that we use across the units, would be things like if we have to look at the flow and management of certain things, that involve at some stage movement of either information, material, anything to do with inventory or, any broader concept around that, that would be looking at creating some sort of a flow. And that flow would clearly direct that this leads to this, this leads to that, and that would at some stage form a flow, and that flow would essentially be, in the commerce sense, when money is involved, when time and quality are involved, and that flow in the essence of time, quality, and money would be then coined as a term called supply chain management or supply chain, because you need to do these things repetitively, and you need to make sure that these things are most efficiently, most cost efficiently, if I start adding adjectives, cost efficiency, time efficiency, quality have to be used, and they have to be transported, or when one from one place to the other, that would essentially mean that you would use the term which is called supply chain in this case. Now, the other thing that I would look at in terms of last would be look at the meaning of the management. Why do you think the process of management essentially in this particular context? What is the any idea in terms of what you mean by management? What is the role of management in this?
Basically, planning the movement or the flow in the most optimum way possible, which has minimum cost, minimum time, and maximum service quality. Utilizing cost and everything in an optimum way.
That is okay. Any ideas of your side?
Sorry?
I'm just asking Hamza as well. Hamza, any ideas in terms of what is the role of management in this?
I don't have exact idea, but I think that managing all the flow in such a way that it gives the optimal results.
So what you also said is partly correct. So what we can is the whole management in this case is the function of interlocking. You know, you have lots of different people, lots of different resources, lots of different technology, lots of different equipment working towards a particular objective. Now, what is the role of management? Management basically looks at interlocking these functions to create a unique procedure. So at stage, the word actually looks at the process from start to the process, how it takes it to the end. So start to finish, the process through which this particular all woven together is done by that person is basically looking at interlocking all these functions to create, you know, flow of things, and that would mean that when you start doing a particular activity, it will go to a particular side of closure. So the management role is basically looking at organizing these process logistics and supply chain. So without that, you would probably not have what is called the process of supply chain happening, or effective transporting, or at some stage, effective logistics happening. The cost would increase in some cases, time might increase in some cases. In some cases, you might have to compromise on certain aspects of quality in terms of either the lead times being more. And if this is not done, the role of management comes in to manage these activities to ensure it takes less time, less cost, and you have a customer delight because the products or services or goods are being delivered on time to a location that is required. Is that okay? Yeah. So let's start off by looking into some of the other details when we look at understanding the learning outcome 1. Now, in learning outcome 1, we are also looking at understanding what are the we look at the process of this operation design and management needs done. Could you think of some factors which basically become important when you look at this concept, logistics and supply management from a global perspective? Any idea on that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So the learning outcome actually says we need to understand some of the key issues in location which affect any side of global operations for a particular business. So what do you think could be the key issues when we look at global operations for a particular business, and why do they look at the process of operation logistics management?
The distance from a location to the facility and to the customer could be an issue.
That's a very good point, because when we look at doing some sort of planning to create either a warehouse or a storage facility, one of the key issues that companies today have is that they want to be closer to the customer in order to service their requirements. So that is one of the key things that we look at, and that is why this can be nicely related to what is the optimal location. So when companies look at planning, say for example capacity, when they look at doing some sort of planning on storage of material, they would then dip into what is the production concept, which we spoke about a bit earlier, which is to understand what are the needs and wants of the customers. And from that particular point of view, they want to then look at choosing a location which will help them move this towards closer or this closer customer in order to service their demand. So one of the things that we actually location in this case. So when we look at production location, then a bit is a process of just determining what site, what particular city is going to be optimum in terms of various things. Things like where do you find the cheapest labor, where do you find good transport links, where do you find good connectivity in terms of infrastructure like road and other things, road, rail and air, and is that location near to a large urban development which would help them actually requirements of a warehouse or a facility in that location. Is that okay? So when we look at, in particular, understanding some of the key concepts in terms of how a company would look at picking up a place for setting up a warehouse or a facility, they would first and foremost look at choosing a location. Now, when we look at location, there are lots of factors that could get into location. So certain factors that could get into the choice for picking up a location could be things like, what is the annual rent that they would pay if they are not looking at buying that particular piece of land facility outright? Does it have availability of skilled manpower to be able to work within that facility? And last but not the least, what kind of transportation links will that location enable for that company to reach to basically, make sure that the products and services they're ordering are able to go across in the most, I would say, efficient, shortest possible time. So these are kinds of factors which the companies would look at when they look at basically choosing, say, an optimal location. Now here, if I have to give you an example, let's look at a company like Amazon Logistics, because we've continued. I've taken an example of Amazon Logistics earlier, so I'll continue with that for the course of day to day. Now, when you look at Amazon Logistics in particular, they start to look at offering. It's a marketplace for a lot of resellers, distributors online. So it's an online marketplace. Now, what Amazon is primarily doing is distributing the products and services which are of third parties to consumers. Now, it has created a platform, and that platform enables e-commerce through which they receive payments, and then obviously by charging costs for, say, for example, delivery, they are utilizing, third parties, in some cases, their own, say, for example, drivers to basically deliver the products and services towards the last mile when it gets delivered to a customer. So let's take a specific example. Now, why location for them is important? Because in Manchester, for example, after about 13, 14 years of operations in the UK, in Manchester, they opened up a very large, storage facility. Now, previously to this, they had a warehouse which is very close to Felixstowe, which is a seaport in the UK, and most sea that comes in, into the UK at Felixstowe. Now, when we look at this, they decided to open up in Manchester, not in any other location, and for that they must have done some research. And this research would mean that they would have done research primarily to look at costs, transport links, look at how close and what areas that particular facility will help them service, and last but not the least, how this would help in production. So most material, when it comes to it, lands up at Felixstowe, and when they look at distribution in northwest of England, in northeast of England, they utilize this particular warehouse, and they feel that moving goods from Felixstowe up to Scotland or other areas in the UK is not very cost effective, and that takes a lot of time. So in that case, after a considerable amount of time, taking a lot of parameters into the mix, they decided to open up a warehousing facility in Manchester. Now, this is a warehouse which employs over 1,000 people, and it is. So when we look at when they started off about 3 years back, they initially advertised about 1,000 jobs. So I'm not too sure in terms of how many people are currently working there, but it works 24/7 as a facility. It's very closely related to the Manchester airport and has access to the airport. But that allows them to look at reducing time, costs, and also making sure that there's availability of manpower to be able to work within that warehouse. And these are some of the factors that we look at when we consider location. So when we look at location, you look at various things like transportation links. At some stage, you also start to look at considering what is, the cost reduction they are going to achieve, or costs which they can reduce in terms of operations when they look at a facility, because that will either allow them to get additional business in that area, or that will allow them to reduce shipping or transportation or times to send these things onward to the customer, and that at some stage would be then looking at improving customer service, and that would mean that at some stage in the long-term view, there would be more customers which will be willing to buy from Amazon, and that would ensure that they have operational cost efficiency over a point in time. Now, let me ask you one other question here. Do you think decisions are done? What is the frequency of these decisions? Why do you think companies look at taking these decisions? And what could be the technical break-even times which companies actually look at considering when they look at taking these large decisions which involve, millions of dollars in terms of investment? What do you think could be the break-even times or the time scale that they actually put to ensure that, if we put this much of, investment in time, money and effort, would actually start to reap some benefits or break even over a point in time? Any ideas, any, thoughts on this?
If I talk about my own company, I think usually when the business is looking to expand, these decisions are not very frequent. They are usually when you want to either set up a new production line or set up a new facility somewhere, or you want to expand your current business. You are sensing a potential demand from a particular area, and you then decide to expand the business. That's when these decisions occur, according to me.
Absolutely correct. So all these factors were taken into, for example, by Toyota when they were actually manufacturing cars in Japan and they were exporting to other parts of the world. But what they initially did in the post-Second World War era, up until the 60s and 70s, was they concentrated all the production to create job employment and opportunities in Japan and grow the economy. But at some stage in the early 80s, they felt that when they started to export some of their material, what they really felt was that this was not very cost effective. And things that you mentioned, like expansion of production capacity, looking at expanding business, looking at, setting up facilities to go near customers. That is where an example of, in your case, that you've given, say, for your company, which is also, is relevant, is because that is what the companies do at some stage when they expand operations, and they have to look at, these various aspects of how cost effectively they can go across to customers to provide products and services. So Toyota did that same, which I've mentioned in this slide as an example, is they decided to open the first plant outside Japan, and that meant that they chose a facility in Kentucky, in Lexington, which has excellent trade links, and that is not very large. That is the largest plant outside Japan which Toyota has created, and that services not just the American market, but the Middle America, and the South American market. So it's one of the largest plants which Toyota has put together, and they manufacture a number of models, and that allows them to achieve cost efficiency rather than manufacturing them in Japan, shipping it to other countries. And over a point in time, they realized that this is something that they had to do. Now, this also leads on to what you mentioned, and what I also alluded to is, with the example of Amazon, is that at some stage, when the company's operation becomes quite big, at some stage they have to look at warehousing and logistics. So if the plant in Lexington is churning out, say, 500, 600 cars a day, and they need to be transported, they need to be stored before they are shipped off to other locations or geographies where they are going to be sold to dealers, that dealers will then dealerships will then onwards sell it to customers. That leads to the concept of creating warehousing and logistics. So you normally would see in news or in pictures, when sometimes when we listen to news, that, if they do an aerial view of a car manufacturing plant, you will see there are probably 5, 6, 10,000 cars parked outside, the plant, because every 30 second, 40 second, every minute, 2 minutes, depending on the car being produced, a new model or a new car is being rolled out from the plant, and they need to store this particular inventory. Now, for the plant, for the company, this is an inventory. At some stage, it's an inventory because it's a car. We are talking about a car manufacturing company, and for them, cars are inventory. So, at inventory, they at some stage need to store this, transport this, and that mass or large scale transportation and storage would then lead to what is called warehousing, and mass scale transportation would be called logistics. So they have to take them across to either the nearest port, go across to different cities, countries, where they will be then being sold to the customers, or in order to meet the demands of the customers. So that is why location in some cases tends to be a difficult option, because you might choose a good location from a point of view of rental or long-term decisions in terms of from a point of view of cost, but you might not get the trained manpower who will be actually working within those factories to produce that output. So it has to be a careful mix, and in some cases, over a point in time, companies decide to open new facilities because of the fact that they feel that production of, say, goods and services would be far cheaper, easier, and easier in terms of transportation and logistics if they do a particular location. So over a point in time, if you look at an example on this slide, which I'm alluding to, is Volkswagen, which is a German car company, and they have created the biggest car manufacturing plant outside Germany in Mexico. And they did not do it in the US, they did not do it in South America, they did it in Mexico, because they felt that, that particular middle belt of the where they are able to get cheaper manpower, and it meets all the other requirements of transportation, warehouse, logistics. They created a plant which basically manufactures about 6,000 different types of cars in a week, and then are easily transportable towards North America and towards South America. And they wanted to be in a market wherein the country's economy is stable. There is not much fluctuation in terms of forex or foreign exchange. And the costs in terms of, when I look at cost, I'm looking at cost in general for everything. Material, transportation, warehousing, are generally more manageable than in the US or in the South American market, because South American market was not that developed. The North American market is quite developed, which has unions and other bits. So if they have to contract or expand depending on the demand and supply from the customers, they felt that there will be lots of issues which relate to manpower at some stage, and that is why they decided to go into a country like Mexico to set up that plant. And that is what also helps them in something called warehousing and logistics, in order to the cost control and the product competitive for selling into other markets. Now, there are lots of other factors that we can also look at when we look at location planning. Now, we've covered and mentioned some of these, but some of the economic factors, if I have to pick up terms, would be things like flexibility. So what do you mean by flexibility when we look at location? Any ideas on that?
Flexibility in terms of location.
Yeah, in terms of location, how relate flexibility to location?
I don't know on the top of my head. It would be on rent and easily movable. The setup could be moved to some other places. I don't know exactly.
So this has a larger connotation, but when I say flexibility, what I mean by flexibility in supply chain in particular would be things like that it is able to respond, because I said economics. So it would be able to respond to changes in demand and the business environment in a very efficient or a competitive way. So sometimes when you look at flexibility, you're looking at flexibility from a point of view of economic conditions. And that would mean that if you're going to set up a production factory or a facility in a particular country, you would want to look at flexibility from a point of view of, how quickly can you respond to changes in demand? How quickly are you able to divert a particular, supply of goods that, or, manufactured goods to a different location? So sometimes an example here I would give you is if you buy shampoos. Now what you see is a lot of companies like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, when they create shampoos, what you generally see is that some of the products, not even shampoos, but generalize it to a lot of products, you would see the user manuals of these products are in different languages. So if I buy something in Europe, you would generally see that the user manual will be in about 3 or 4 or 5 languages in particular. So it will have English, it will have German, Spanish, Italian, and French. Now, if broadly they cover these 5 languages, what does that mean is if it is there on packaging, if it is there on the user manuals or anything related to the product, it allows them flexibility to be able to shift that product into any geography or any particular country, depending on where the demand is more. And that also looks at a factor of how they choose locations when they set up production facilities. Is that okay?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and you able to relate to that? When you look at shampoos, if I look at, say, for example, Pantene, you would probably have a Middle Eastern language, Arabic on it, you'll have English on it, you'll have some other language on it. But that product, that would mean, could go across the entire Middle Eastern market, depending on where the demand is more or where the supply required is higher, and the companies could divert that. Now, if they manufacture it according to just the markets, they have to be very accurate in their materials planning and forecasting. But in some cases, some of these large organizations require that flexibility. So that is why location is also important. The economies of scale, that is a term which explains itself. Economies of scale would not go in and invest into market if they are not very sure that they're going to get returns on the investment that they are looking at, or will not open up a manufacturing or a production facility if they do not see enough demand, coming from that particular place in the next couple of months, weeks, months, years, and in the time to come. And then the other thing is, sometimes you look at fixed costs. Now, today, fixed costs are directly associated with production technologies. You see that in car manufacturing industry in particular, and in a lot of other industries like retailing of grocery and other products. If I look at Amazon, for example, even within their warehouses, they've started to employ a lot of robotics. And the robotics side of things basically brings in technology, which is to make it more efficient and less time consuming. And over a point in time, these lead to what is called decrease in the cost. Now, when we talk about fixed costs and we talk about variable costs, what are fixed costs? Fixed costs are costs which the company would invest in, would buy something, and over a point in time claim depreciation to basically amortize that into the balance sheet. Variable costs would be things like a manpower. So when they buy technology, when a company invests, for example, in buying SAP or enterprise resource planning, they will have to spend a lot of cost, but the efficiencies of these costs would actually be realized over the years because they will make and bring efficiency into different departments by using the software, by using this technology, sharing of information, faster communication, and that would bring what is called the costs overall down, and in long term give benefits to the organization. So they will have to incur maybe higher fixed costs when they start a location, and when I say location here would be if they set up a warehouse, there'll be a big cost to set up a warehouse because warehouse can be expanded, but they will start with a basic size, or construction cost will be higher, and the cost which is involved in setting that up as a facility would be required. But what companies nowadays are also looking at doing is introducing technologies which would mean that that is a part of the fixed cost, but over a point in time, it helps bring more efficiency in terms of, the whole set of operations. Is that okay? And variable costs tend to be costs like manpower or labor, because depending on, like in the UK and generally across the world now, because of Christmas, you will see a lot of temp jobs get created in, warehousing companies, Amazon in particular, and other locations, is because they need more, people to be able to service customers. So that is where the variable cost during this period goes up. But having that additional cost also means that the companies are trying to push more sales to consumers in order to get, to the desired profits that they need. So this tends to be a variable cost. But once the festive season elapses, the temp contract or the contract labor would be obviously laid off, or obviously their contracts are only up till Christmas. And after that, it goes back to, the normal costs which the company incurs or the HR incurs in this case. Is that okay? Now, let's look at some of the briefly some points. When do you think location issues or decisions on locations can actually backfire? And I've given some examples on the slide, but sometimes cultural issues could be issues because of which the location decision on that location the company has taken could backfire. Is that okay? So if you look at KFC, if you look at McDonald's, for example, when they look at opening of restaurants, they do a lot of research. But when they do a lot of research, sometimes they miss out on certain things, which would mean that, if the language is not taken care of, or the regional customs are not taken care of in order to, closely align them towards the cultural practices of that country, they might not have an upkeep or uptake for that particular product. from consumers in that market. So location for them, when I say them, I mean large organizations, is quite important, because they have to look at ensuring that there's also a term that I normally, you must have heard across. When you look at globalization and localization, over the years, this term has become global. That means you have global options, but you're localizing the products and services that you're selling in the market. And the reason why this has been done is in order to primarily look at, adapting to cultural requirements and nuances of that geography. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, some of the other reasons that we look at is reasons which could backfire in terms of location, could be quality and safety problems. So here I would give an example of, looking at Bangladesh, for example, and a lot of companies from the Western world has outsourced, clothes manufacturing, because they find cheap labor, transportation, warehousing, production is quite cheap. So when you look at that as a concept, that has also given, rise to problems which are related to, safety, health and safety in particular. So there have been some very large incidents wherein in factories there have been fires and proper safety audits have not been done, and that has led to a large scale, death of workers within that factory. And local organizations like Primark, H&M have come under fire now to ensure that the factories that they use, the facilities that they use, are primarily, having proper quality standards implemented, not just on paper, but also ensuring that health and safety issues are taken care of in those locations. If you look at Apple, for example, it has two large manufacturers in China. It has one large manufacturing facility in Taiwan, Foxconn. You look at some of these companies, and from time to time you get to hear in the news that workers are being asked to work 14-hour shifts. You see photos of workers sleeping on the line, assembly line. So sometimes these problems, even when they look at trained manpower, cheaper labor, faster turnaround time, all those things can actually backfire because of the issues of quality and safety and workers' benefits not being provided as promised by companies when they outsource these operations. Is that okay? Yes. So we've looked at transportation, we've looked at forex and currency exchange rates, and the example that ties into is the Japanese yen, which became, for example, quite strong against the dollar, and that is where the Japanese government and Japanese companies, when you look at the large companies like Sony, you look at Matsushita, you look at Nissan, you look at Toyota, they started to venture out because they felt that because of the strong Japanese economy and the exchange rates, it became negative, in the sense not profitable for them to manufacture goods in Japan and then export to other countries. And that also contributed for them to start to explore locations where these companies then set up large bases of manufacturing to ensure that they could find cheaper locations, cheaper countries, cheaper skilled manpower to be able to do that production. Now, sometimes you also have import restrictions, and this is also a easy point to understand when we look at location. Is that in some countries, if the good is not manufactured in that geography and you are exporting raw material from outside, there is import-export duty. So duties also then, to a certain extent, are very important for companies to consider when they set up large production bases or choose a location for warehousing, storage, whatever it is. Because if there are duties or policies, government legislation which apply, which basically look at dumping duties, and one of the things that you look at now, I'm not sure whether you've read in the news, but in the last few months and years, in the last 2-3 years, China in particular has been, getting a lot of slack in terms of the steel companies, because China is manufacturing steel at a very, very low cost. And then it is dumping it into other markets wherein the local manufacturing in those markets are being affected. So, for example, if you look at the UK, if you look at China imports a lot of iron ore from Australia, from other countries like Brazil, India, and it is able to manufacture because of the large-scale manufacturing setup it has, and then export that at very low cost to other countries. So a lot of these countries have also looked at governments have looked at creating legislation, and these are called duties, which are applied on low-cost products which are coming into the market, and it is basically affecting the local distribution and supply chain and also manufacturing in those countries. The current example of trade war between China and America. So there's a lot of trade surplus which the Chinese government has with the US, but there's a lot of deficit with the US has when it looks at its imports and exports with China. So the regulation which the governments are trying to create and to duties are related to what are called the import-export restrictions, and this then tends to ensure that companies abroad which are manufacturing goods and services are not able to bring goods cheaper into the country, which are cheaper than the local suppliers or manufacturers. So this is also one of the key things which countries look at. And over the world, if you look at, there are some countries which are now termed as low manufacturing cost countries or bases, and they include countries like China, Mexico, Philippines, and Thailand. And that is where these countries are come under a lot of scrutiny when large global companies are able to outsource operations to these countries, get the goods manufactured, and bring them back into their own country for sales or globally for sales, and they are then classed as dumping low quality products to drive domestic demand or demand from consumers. So in some cases, locations companies choose countries for outsourcing can also become it can backfire essentially, or can have a negative side on this side of operations. So this was basically understanding why location is important and how companies choose location depending on the positives and negatives, and how it can affect what is to do with something called supply chain logistics and in general operations for a particular. Any questions on this? Okay, let's move on to then task 1.2, which basically talks about how do we evaluate planning processes and how to get designing optimum layouts. Now let's understand one or two of these key terms first. Now, what is facilities planning? The key term in this task is, if I look at it, says evaluate facilities planning process. What is facilities planning? Any idea what is facilities planning?
When they set up a plant, when you set up a warehouse, like pallets and stuff like that, which
Correct. So
operations.
Absolutely. So if you look at, say, for example, a simple example which is much closer to us, if you're planning to build a house, you at some stage do some planning on a piece of paper, you get down to the drawing board, and what you do is you look at how many rooms do you need, and then that is what you will pass on to the contractor who's actually going to be building your house. So when you look at facilities planning on a personal level, you're looking at giving him we need 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms, 1 drawing room, 1 reception room, kitchen, how many bathrooms, the layout of that whole particular house, and what are the key things that you need in that particular place. You need central heating, you need air conditioning, you need Cat5 cabling across, phone sockets, cable. All this is related to what is called planning. So when you're looking at getting into a house, buying a house, you look at all these things from a personal perspective. So when we look at facilities planning from a logistics point of view, what we are looking at is how are we going to look at determining basically the activity which is going to be related around what are going to be the fixed assets that we are going to put in, and then also best manage this from a long-term perspective of utilization. So it determines primarily how much you're going to put in terms of money, and then what are the best output that you can get from what the investment has been done. You might want to look at designing a house or planning a house with so many features, but at some stage, all of this will need to be costed. So if you say I want a 6-bedroom house and you have a 1,000 square feet plot, and then you're trying to put a lot of things in, raw material, building blocks, everything, the contractor would come back and say, okay, this is the cost of raw material that I need, these many bricks I need, this is the cement and all that. So similarly, when companies look at setting up, say, for example, a warehouse or a production facility, they would look at doing facilities planning. An example in this context, when we look at logistics and supply chain management, would be, say, in the case of manufacturing, the objective is to look at how do they support production. So if you set up a warehouse, you set up a production facility or a new plant or an extension to an existing plant, the first question which the management would end up asking would be, how does it support production? Is it going to increase this, supply chain? Is it going to increase the manufacturing facility? So those kind of things the management would end up asking. Another example could be that one of the objectives would be that if you're looking at producing a lot of goods, how closer are you to, say, transportation links to be able to transport? Is it being manufactured for local market? Is it being manufactured for export, for overseas? So some part of that could be related to when we look at, how closer is that to, say, the airport or the transportation link. In the case of hospitals, for example, when we look at bed planning, how many beds does the hospital have? What kind of, care it will provide to the patient? So will it have cancer care? Will it have pediatrics? Will it have gynecologists or, children related? Will it have, say, for example, osteo related, which is bones? What kind of care will the hospital plan? So at some stage, you look at the planning as a process. In whichever sector we look at, planning becomes a key part of the process to understand what the final output, once it is ready, would actually cater to in terms of consumers' demand or, in this case, hospital, when I look at what kind of patients it will cater to. Sometimes you have a specific symptom, and what the doctor would do is you need to go across to this particular hospital. Say, for example, cardiology. You want to get an operation, then you have to go to this hospital. It might not be present in one particular hospital. So in those cases, the objectives are to look at planning what kind of, or options would it give customers. Now, let's understand what is facilities planning life cycle. Now, at some stage when you start this up, you're looking at basically starting it up from understanding what will it provide. So there is some sort of a plan. That plan then needs to be elaborated, and you have a buy-in from the stakeholders, which could be management. At some stage when that project plan is approved, you look at applying some quality aspect into it in terms of the timelines. You create a Gantt chart or a timeline through which various parts of the processes or the project would be broken up into processes. And then at some stage, once everything is clear, it is signed off, at some stage it starts into the process of, you put this into production. That means the building starts, the manufacturing starts. So even if we are looking at a warehouse, at some stage what will happen is once the costs are approved, the designs are approved, health and safety inspections have been done, you acquired the land, the company at some stage would pass that on to contractors, and that is where obviously the the planning on the construction side would start. So facilities, when you look at, they tend to have some sort of a planning life cycle, and this then could be applied across when we look at any facet of logistics and supply chain management. Now, there are different types of planning. When we look at planning for a location, we look at the structure, what kind of structure you would want to put in a location. If it's a warehouse being constructed, what kind of equipment will it have, what kind of facilities it will cater to. Now, most warehouses, when you look at, they also have something called distribution space, or in which the products can come in, be loaded onto trucks or loaded onto rail freight, whatever, and then can also receive incoming material or raw material into the warehouse. So when we look at facilities planning, we look at location, we look at the structure, we look at layout. So when you look at just-in-time systems, which we'll cover in Learning Outcome 2, most Japanese factories in terms of manufacturing have a very specific layout, because what they want to do is basically bring in the raw material which comes in, or as parts which come in from outside supply chain or ancillary supply chain into the main factory for manufacturing, comes in a particular location within the factory, so that the inwards and outwards supply of those things coming in and going out is planned and designed in the layout in such a way that it has very minimal obstructions with regards to the overall working of the plant. And at some stage, we also look at handling systems. Now, if I go back 30, 40 years back, when we go back 3, 4 decades back, most of the production facilities did not have a lot of automation. Most of this was manually handled by labor, or there were very few, technical equipments to handle things. You look at a normal warehouse today, you have what you call forklifts, and you have, automated forklifts today. And in terms of when you have to look at any particular warehouse for, storage, you now have not everything 1 or 2 story, but you have, about 10 stories or 10 layers in which stacking of things could happen. And in order to handle the removal and restocking of this goods and materials within a particular warehouse, you have to look at handling systems. And in some cases, you have these systems which are automated, which are robot-led or, mechanized in terms of, and then in some cases use equipment which is run by people to handle the, inventory within a warehouse. So when you look at facilities planning, some of these factors, have to be considered. And when you look at alleys or bays which are created, they're quite large, and they are created from a point of view of understanding that what kind of machinery or equipment will be required to move into that particular warehouse. Is that okay? Yeah. Now, when we look at, implementing an optimal layout, I think what I want you to do is basically look at, let's look at a video of Amazon Logistics warehouse video. If I can find one on YouTube. What we want to be able to look at is how does how does it affect facilities planning? So just have a brief look. We'll quickly shut off the voice, but the idea is to try and show if I can look at how the material handling typically happens. So just let this ad play out. That's behind the scenes. Okay, that could be one. So if you look at this equipment, some part of this, if you look at this is an Amazon warehouse which they are showing in terms of the back-end scenes, like it's equal to 59 football fields. You see some of the shelving and stacking, the machinery which is being used, like these, the manpower, for example, the people working within the warehouse are using, there are some robots, there are some mechanized equipment. These are automatic robots which basically move in the inventory. And these are new things which have been introduced in a modern warehouse. When we look at Amazon in particular, Waitrose, some of the large warehousing which is happening in developed countries. Now, when we look at this in particular, what we are looking at is that when you plan a facility, and say an example in this case a warehouse, what we do get to see is there are lots of types of equipment and handling of goods and material which will happen, which the company needs to look at initially planning. It cannot say at some stage that, oh, we can keep the bays that wide, this does not allow this movement to happen or this equipment to come in and work. So these are things which they have to do in terms of planning itself when they design the warehouse. Where all will be the checkout terminals, where all manpower will be involved, what all places within the facility will actually be totally mechanized, where the material will come in, in terms of things like carton, and in this case, packaging material would come in, how it gets sorted, things in terms of, usage of technology, which is to electronically barcode, the material so that it can be tracked within the warehouse, is all a part of, facilities planning. Now, this all has to be envisaged by somebody who's looking at creating this particular facility. Is that okay? Yeah. Yes. And when we look at planning, when we look at in particular planning process, all this has to be looked at in the layout design of a particular facility. So that means you will consider factors like, which I put on the slide, is things like future expansion or change. If the company's products or output is to change, will the facility be able to cope with that change in terms of, the process? Would they be able to incorporate a new type of product being manufactured within the process? Now, if I go back to car manufacturing facility, you generally see the car manufacturing plants which are put or created by manufacturers overseas. They look at producing or creating these plants to manufacture certain types of models. Not all types of models are manufactured. Now, if they have to add manufacturing of a new model, what they look at is future expansion, the scope of future expansion. That means Toyota, for example, when it set up a manufacturing base in the US, they clearly did a research and they found out that it is going to be large, more powerful vehicles which are in demand rather than the small cars which are in production within Japan. So when you look at large vehicles, powerful vehicles in terms of engines, their facility was made from a point of view of primarily servicing the US market. But over a point in time, now when we look at, the shift is happening towards electric cars. So at some stage, most of these manufacturing facilities are looking at expanding, add an electric, manufacturing facility or expansion into the current plant. Now, whether that's feasible or not feasible, because it was not anticipated maybe 20, 30 years back when the plant was, created, is something which could not have been anticipated. But today, if a manufacturer is looking at setting up a plant and they know clearly that there's going to be a shift from diesel, petrol-led vehicles to electric vehicles in a particular geography because of the changing government legislation, they have to look at these factors which could impact the planning of that particular site. Now, whether that's a manufacturing site, storage site, does not matter, but they have to look at future, impact which it will have from a point of view of government legislation in particular, in mostly developed countries at this stage. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, when we look at, flow of goods, one of the factors which can also affect optimal layout, or, when you plan a facility, when you look at the layout of that facility, one of the things which would also affect that would be how flow of goods going to happen within the warehouse. So when I go back to this same video and I look at, for example, the flow of goods at some stage in the US now, they're currently also clearing some airspace to try out drones, which will actually look at delivering, products and services to customers directly. But when we look at the main part of the warehouse, when it is planned, they need to look at planning the flow or the layout of the plant. So how would the goods actually flow? Where would the material come in from manufacturers when the orders are picked up, and from where it will get packed, boxed, and get dispatched, to a delivery bay where it will be picked up by the delivery drivers and it will go across for, final out delivery to the customers. And then there is storage. So if the minimum order quantity of the inventory falls below a particular level, the reordering triggers, and some part of the warehouse, in this case, is primarily only catering to storage. That means they have inventory for 10 days, 4 days, 10 days, 7 days. I'm just making it up, but depending on the supply of those goods, and they know how quickly they need to be replenished, they would then look at also storage of goods in terms of inventory in the warehouse. So flow of movement of goods is very important when you look at planning a facility. Is that okay? Now, any questions on this so far? Okay. So let's look at some of the other factors in terms of communication and support. Now, again, by just showing this particular video, you would see that in some places, some part of the process has been automated. That means automatic labeling is happening, barcoding is happening. There are robots which are primarily recognizing, the flow of goods happening within the warehouse. So when you look at that, what we are essentially seeing at some stages that in this case, when the facilities planning is done, and at some stage they know where clearly the barcode needs to be put, where clearly the boxing needs to happen, all the goods come into a particular box. If you've ordered multiple products, then at some stage, the communication and the pickup of these goods needs to be organized. One of the other videos that I will show you in the next session would be how Royal Mail in the UK, which does about 2 billion, which is about 2 billion packages of post and letters every year, has a facility to sort out letters on the basis of electronic sorting out facility on the basis of postcodes. And this is primarily related to ease the flow of communication and, say the movement of the delivery to a particular bay, which allows the personnel to pick it up on the basis of postcode, city, location, and then onwards to the post onwards going to the door box or the mailbox of the customer. Now, in all this, one of the key aspects that you look at is also safety. So when you plan a large facility where you'll have about 3,000-4,000 workers working 24/7, 3 shifts maybe running, there is always a key aspect of how to look at safety. There have been some, major incidents of, say for example, warehouses, and I'll show you a video, which is just 1 second. Basically, what has happened is that the warehouse shelving has collapsed, and that has led to, obviously, death and injury to a lot of workers within the, warehouse. Let me show this particular video. So you would generally see that what has happened is maybe some parts somewhere the safety standards have not been adhered to, or there is a lot of load on the racks, and you will see how the racks actually collapse, and a number of workers in the entire warehouse obviously gets destroyed. So it's a small video, but basically safety is one of the key aspects when you look at facilities planning. As you can see, the machinery is very close to the racks, and somewhere it touches the racks, creates that movement, and as you can see, the whole shelving, everything collapses. And this leads to, it basically, what does it show when you look at this particular video? What does it show?
It is showing disaster.
Absolutely. But this has happened primarily because at some stage, the staff handling or, working on that machine has not been given adequate training to understand what is the minimum distance that you need to maintain between, the equipment that you're driving, and that equipment should not touch or, so let me, I don't know whether you've been to a warehouse, but I'll give you a practical example. When I've gone to a warehouse, what they do is they demarcate certain areas by using tapes, and that is the areas in which you walk. So there are tapings or areas which are marked clearly wherein walking, pathways are created within the facility. And you're not supposed to go beyond that into the other areas, because that would lead to occupational health and safety hazards. That means there could be issues in terms of machine, automated robots functioning. There could be issues in terms of, machines or, conveyor belts and other things or equipment running automatically, which would create a hazard for you. So when you see these tapings across within the warehouse, and when they talk about health and safety, they look at maintaining neat and clean layouts, no liquids on the floor, when in order to basically look at clearing the pathways where the movement of machinery is done, is all done to ensure safety is adhered to when you look at planning in terms of, large facilities like this. And that's what you saw in that video. So what happened was the person driving the forklift, came very close to one of the racks. It has lots of loads on it weight-wise, and what at the end of the day happened is when the forklift or the electronic, forklift clipped one of the racks, touched it, it created a bit of a resonance in terms of disturbance, and that led to the collapse of, the facility, and obviously a lot of deaths and injury within that warehouse. So this is a cause of concern when you look at one of the factors which is implemented in facility planning process is to adhere to safety standards which have been set within this field, in all areas. So this was an example of a warehouse, but you will see that in shipping side of things, you will see that in air freight side of things, in road side of things. And when they say that this container has a 40-ton tonnage and cannot exceed, when you look at volumetric capacity or volumetric weight, is done for a particular reason. And that is where this facilities planning puts into place the safety aspect of it as one of the factors, whether it's a warehouse, whether it's a storage department, or anything which is related to material planning. Now there are some other factors which I will briefly touch on, and they are self-explanatory. When we look at things like promotional value, in some cases when you look at the Tesla factory, if you look at a large facility, the gigabit factory which Tesla has created in California is also a factory, or the Apple campus, for example, in Palo Alto, in California, the dome-shaped campus that they've created. What they've done is it also invites a lot of interest towards visitors, people who want to come in and see the facility. Sometimes they would see that manufacturers look at creating a bit of confidence, word of mouth with customers when they invite you in to see a particular facility, to see how manufacturing is being done, to build reputation, to build brand. So sometimes you will see that when you plan any sort of manufacturing facility, any sort of facility, manufacturing, storage, warehousing, whatever it is, you will see that in some cases, companies, if they create a flagship facility, they also create a certain sort of a space which has open access to visitors, the business customers or visitors. And this is primarily done to create word of mouth, or primarily to look at operational side of things, to promote the company's reputation. And in this case, you also see that they create a small facility wherein customers can come in, have some tea, observe it from outside through glass cages, and you have a positive vibe about it, because you're actually seeing your car being manufactured, you're actually seeing your products being manufactured, and those kind of things are also done. Now, last but not the least, when you look at space utilization, why do you think space is important when you look at planning facilities? Any idea? When we look at space utilization?
Because to maintain the distance from walking and from movement and racks, and basically so that maximum storage could happen in minimum space. Designing.
That's correct. So when you look at space planning within a facility, we just look at square footage space. But square footage space does not mean just you plan horizontal space. In warehousing facilities, you look at vertical space as well. So you look at horizontal and vertical both. So we looked at the example of that warehouse, how many stacks to be created, how many levels to be created, what equipments you need to have to be able to lift that load up to that particular level and bring it down safely. So those things have to be looked at for space utilization, because at the end of the day, it directly is related to rentals, it directly is related to costs, and also to equipment that you would be needing to work through within that particular facility. And that's why space utilization is also important. Now, there are lots of issues which sometimes can get created when you look at facilities planning, and these issues tend to be issues like how many warehouses would you plan, what is the size of warehousing, how many distribution centers you want to have within a particular city or a country. There is a very important example, I'm forgetting the company's name. What is the most popular ice cream in Pakistan? Ice cream brand in Pakistan?
Walls.
What is the Walls? Okay. And there is a local brand as well. Walls is now owned by Unilever, isn't it?
Yes.
So what is the other local brand which takes up these biggies like Unilever?
Local would be, I think, ATHE is local.
Maybe. Okay. I'll explain this example, because one of my students earlier did a research in terms of distribution. And one of the key things when you look at ice cream during the summer months is that the availability of these fridges and counters, which most of these companies actually distribute free of cost, because they want to look at this being as a part of infrastructure that they provide to ensure that more and more of these products are sold to customers during that season. Now, what tends to happen is how many such free facilities or free freezers can the producers actually distribute. So what they've done over the years is they've created distribution centers wherein this product is stored, but when this product needs to be transported, it needs to have refrigerized transportation. So most of the lorries and other things which actually distribute these to the local centers actually use it during summer periods with refrigerized containers. So when you look at planning, how many fridge and freezers can be distributed free? How many distribution centers can you create? So in some cases, some of these things have to be manufactured locally. So over the years, what has happened is Unilever, when they got into this business and acquired a lot of brands, they started with their own, but over the years, I think they've acquired about 72 brands globally. And the reason why they've done it is that they need to, this is a perishable product, and this perishable product requires a lot of distribution centers, specifically during summer months or in places which have tropical climate. So centralized versus decentralized storage supplies has to be implemented as a process when we look at ice cream ice cream as a product, with companies selling this, or any product which requires refrigeration. So that would mean that centralized warehousing or resourcing would not work, but localized or decentralized storage and resourcing would work in some of these products. So that is where sometimes when you look at facilities planning, it can be turned upside down on its head to say that these products require actually to create a success in the market for sales, profitability, decentralized storage or decentralized production rather than centralized production. Is that okay?
Yes.
So that example covers that. And then let's look at some of the strategic functions of planning. Why do we look at facilities planning as a strategic function? Because it is long term. You know, companies at some stage would look at whether they need to outsource some part of this operation in order to save costs, or whether they need to look at vertical integration. Do you understand what is vertical integration and horizontal integration? Any idea in terms of what is vertical integration? So vertical integration is primarily when the company actually wants to own everything in the supply chain that it produces. So if I look at car manufacturing, generally does not have vertical integration because the car company would produce the engine, the chassis and other things would come from the ancillary suppliers. But vertical integration would, and that would be an example of horizontal integration. So they have lots of ancillary suppliers coming in, they assemble the product and sell it as a finished product and then sell it in the market. Vertical integration is where the company would want to the entire supply chain in terms of manufacturing from nuts and bolts to the finished product. So sometimes when you look at facilities planning, the strategic side of things in this case has to be whether the company would look at subcontracting, outsourcing, vertical integration, and in terms of how to look at getting the maximum returns in terms of cost that they would want to invest in creating that facility. Now let's briefly look at, I know this lecture is extended quite a lot today, but because it was the first one, what I wanted to do is give you a bit of a grounds and fundamentals on the overall unit. But let's look at the last the last task, which is 1.3 in the learning outcome 1. Now, what are quantitative approaches to location and layout modeling? Now, when I say quantitative, we earlier discussed quantitative is related to numbers. So when we look at different types of layout and planning of facilities, we look at there are lots of different methods. There are different methods which could be looked at from a point of view of there are 7 or 8 different types. But what we are going to today look at is when we look at location and facility in general, we're going to discuss a couple of factors, and these could be factors or models which are looking at things like factor rating method, breakeven analysis, center of gravity method, and geographic information system or GIS method. Now, some of the methods that we look at, there are other methods as well. There are simulation methods. There are different types of methods or models, things like location breakeven analysis. We also have analytical DiLSCM method. We also have rate of return methods. Now, these are different methods which have been invented over the years to look at how planning as a process could work. And if you're a manufacturer, if you're a company or an organization which is looking at manufacturing, storage, transporting, or onwards storage from warehousing to distribution of products and goods and services, at some stage you would look at relating everything to costs. So when we look at planning, some part of these models have been created to help you efficiently look at an approach to selecting a location, and then within that location design a layout which is going to be most cost effective for you to be able to look at storage, production, and onwards distribution of goods and services. Now, in the factor rating method, there are lots of different location alternatives which are evaluated, and what they are looking at in this case is ranking the various factors on a scale of 1 to 5 or on a scale of 1 to 10. So in short, if I have to understand the factor rating method, what I'm going to be looking at is that in this particular model, what you're looking at doing is primarily rating some of the important parameters which are going to be strategic for you, important for you in your planning process, to rate them against a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Now, some of the factors when people look at planning this, say, example, a warehouse, would be things like transportation. They would look at labor market, for example, in terms of availability of skilled labor. They might look at accessibility to local suppliers, which would provide the raw material. In some cases, it could be taxes, it could be salaries, it could be, in general, the legislation within that area. But what you have to do is rate these factors in terms of their importance. So, and when you rate these factors in terms of their importance, you are going to be coming up to a maximum total score, which will allow you to choose a particular location on the basis of this method. Is that okay? And what I've done is I've given an example here in the slide that if I look at some of the factors which are important before I set up a warehouse, things like tax incentives, a lot of governments, councils give the organization some sort of a taxation rebate or incentive for 5 years to say you'll pay less tax or things like that, because they see this as an opportunity for the company to come in and create jobs, economic development, upliftment in that particular city or that location. So companies would look at things like tax incentive, labor availability, proximity to customers, site expansion scope if they have to expand in the future, what is the scope for logistics, and then what are the supporting ancillary industries which are available, which will provide raw material, goods and services in that location. So what they will look at is rank this for various locations that you would look at setting up that facility. So example I've taken is if Amazon was to open a warehouse in London, Germany, how would they do the ranking on the basis of these factors? And the total score that you get, depending on that, the higher score that you're getting, you would end up choosing that location on the basis of, factor method. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now let's look at break-even analysis. What is break-even analysis in general? Any idea?
Break-even is when cost and revenue are even in finance terms.
Right. So this particular concept comes across from production management or from accounting when they look at break-even analysis. So here, what you rightly said is we are looking at categorizing cost vis-a-vis the fixed cost versus the variable cost. So what we look at is how can cost change when the output of a particular product changes? How can cost be directly attributed to the volume of production that you do? So break-even analysis would be used as a method here, wherein what you will do is for each location we'll determine the fixed and variable costs per unit, and then on a graph plot this across versus fixed and variable costs. So the axis tends to be output versus costs, and when you look at that axis, you plot the total cost on vertical axis and the annualized production or the output on a horizontal axis. And depending on where you find the optimal balance, when you do the break even on the chart, you find the median point, and that is the location that you will generally choose basis the break even method. So an example here I've given is that ABC company is looking at expanding its plant capacity. There's 3 locations in mind, but what the 3 locations will generate in terms of revenue and what the costs will be to create that particular output is actually calculated. And depending on the cheapest cost that you would receive with the highest number of manufactured units would then give you the break even, and that is the location that you will end up choosing. Now, the next method that we will look at is center of gravity method. So in this method, what we use is we determine the location of a single warehouse or a distribution center to minimize its distribution costs. Now, that would mean that if the distribution costs are linear function, then the only distance, the only thing which is going to directly affect the costs would be the distance to which the goods have to be delivered or shipped to. So if the Amazon warehouse in Manchester, for example, has to deliver goods, it will put a physical perimeter in terms of how many miles it will deliver from that warehouse. It will not deliver goods from here to Leeds, which is 60 miles across, because that would mean the cost of distribution of that good. If somebody has bought, for example, a stapler, which is say £3, and that has to be shipped to a customer in Leeds, 60 miles away, from Manchester, it would not be serviced from the Manchester warehouse, because here the cost of distribution will overweigh the cost of storing or warehousing in a particular location. So they will have to find alternative methods to be able to look at producing or selling those goods in that particular location. So this method, which attempts to locate a facility, sometimes which, a practical example of this would be when you order a good, Now, Amazon knows your location and your address. So what it will do is it has maybe 10 warehouses or shipping, distribution facilities in the UK. It will be required for them to use this method because basis this, they will calculate this product is, the stapler is available across the 10 warehouses they have. Now, how would they calculate the cost is using the center of gravity method to understand from which warehouse to the customer's address it's going to be cheapest for them to deliver the good. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So in this case, the center of gravity method looks at, I have lots of goods which are stored in all the warehouses because they cannot predict the demand or the ordering process from the customer. If it is ordered, what it will do is basically calculate the nearest distance from the warehouse to the customer's address, and that would give them the most effective cost of delivering this good across to the customer what they've ordered. Now, over a point in time, what tends to happen is if the goods are not moving from that warehouse or the demand is very low and they have more quantity, the warehousing team reduces the minimum inventory that they keep in the location in order for them to service it and move that to a location wherein it is being sold more or the frequency of sale is higher. Okay. The last method that we look at is geographical information systems method, and here a computerized system is used which can store and details of the product or data, and basis their geographic location, the good can then be serviced or sent across to the customer's location. So this as a concept is being used extensively now by companies to move inventory, because if you see an example of Starbucks, they know they sell and distribute and serve within their stores some 45 different brands of types of coffee. But there are certain stores which basically, have a consumption of, say, chai latte or cafe latte, for example. Now, depending on the demand, they know because of the connectivity that they have across various stores, and the use of management information systems allows them to move inventory across various locations. And this allows for something called disaster planning. So with the use of technology, this new method which has come in, and the reason why I put this method also on the slide is that a lot of companies which are basically servicing customer demand and the goods are perishable goods are in this case using what is called the geographic information system, because the information from each and every outlet in terms of sales is everything in terms of inventory is being collated centrally in a system in the background, and that information which is being collated centrally in the background is then accessible to the management, and on the basis of which they can actually do this planning or movement of inventory, and that tends to happen because of technology being the link between various outlets from which the customers are being served. Is that okay?
Yes.
So with this, we have covered learning outcome 1. Any questions that you have?
No, that's okay. Can we start the assessment or the assignment on the basis of this lesson?
Yes, you can do that. Yes. So for this particular unit, what I've done is, if you see and log into Moodle, I've just done a bit of a reorganization on the unit 1, Principles of Logistics Management, and I've uploaded a book here which wasn't earlier uploaded by the systems guy. And then I've also uploaded 2 books, one on linear programming in particular, and then one on the logistics and supply chain management, which will primarily be helpful for you to look at learning outcome 4 in particular when we do the quantitative techniques for this particular unit. So if I look at the assignment brief, they have been put at the last, as you can see in the first unit here, and also in this unit that we are studying operations and design management. So if I click on this assignment brief, it will open up, and the assignment brief is basically a report that we need to produce, and that report has this instruction. So it says, with reference to one of the topics listed below, select an academic journal or an article relevant to the chosen industry sector which involves physical flow of raw material, components, finished goods, and use this to write a report which will summarize how you understand the whole process of planning, logistics, supply chain in relation to design and operations management. So when you look at this particular assignment brief, we have to create one particular report, and what I've done in the handouts is that I've put in some examples of case studies. So when I look at some example of case studies, what I've put is one case study here in particular, which is looking at, cell phone manufacturing. So what I would suggest is that at some stage when you look at, reading into this, these are case studies which are going to be important for you to understand and pick up, something that you want to look at doing the assignment. So these 4 or 5 case studies you can look at and then, start looking at doing the assignment. Because here what you're looking at doing is basically in the assignment brief, covering some of these aspects, which are basically the learning outcomes that we're going to discuss to explain how the whole process of operations design and management actually works within the context of logistics and supply chain management. So if I look at this particular unit, this is where, so one of the case studies that I picked out is, for layout design. One of them looks at lean manufacturing. So there is a handout on lean manufacturing operations, which is a case study. There is one case study on warehouse management and one on forecasting techniques. So all these 4 are basically looking at these 4 concepts. So you could pick out one of the case studies and start writing a report in your own words. So if I look at explaining, for example, one particular case study, let me open up the Nissan case study, which is something which is going to be. So if I look at this, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
we have to cover just one topic, like either layout design or lean manufacturing, or all of these?
No, only one. You have to use one of the topics listed below. One. Only one. So in some cases, what I would do is basically look at the case study of Nissan manufacturer, and in this profile, how they've done layout planning is something which is related to this particular topic, and you could use this, read this particular topic, and then sum about 1,000 words, which covers everything that we're going to discuss in this unit, and that would help you achieve this particular assignment. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good stuff. So any other questions if you have with regards to the learning outcome 1? If you have any queries or any questions, feel free to drop me an email at learnerwork@ukversity.co.uk, and what we could do is basically I will pick this up and I'll quickly reply to you. But I think what I've done this morning before I started the session is to just organize it in such a way that you are able to address the assignment brief and also look at what you have to study from a point of view of different handouts related to the topics as well.
All right.
Okay. I'll catch up with you next week. We'll start learning outcome 2 with regards to the presentation. I am going to upload this slightly updated version of the presentation, which is slightly updated because I think the last time this topic was delivered by somebody else, but most of the presentation remains the same. But there are 2 or 3 slides which have changed slightly in order to include some of the key terminology that we've discussed before we started this. So this will also be up on the Moodle in the next couple of minutes.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Take care. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll catch up with you next week.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.